I wanted to first introduce myself and I'll introduce Lori and I'll have her speak a little bit as well. I am the Chief Innovation Officer at the Solutions Journalism Network. My background is in filmmaking and in communications and storytelling. I started as the first communications director at the Solutions Journalism Network several years ago. The Solutions Journalism Network is a journalism support organization that's been around for about 11 years now. We celebrated our 10th anniversary last year. And one of the main things that we're going to be talking about is an initiative we have at SJN called the Solutions Insights Lab. It's a specific initiative that leverages the approach of solutions journalism, but for non-journalist audience, specifically in this case, social change or entrepreneurs. And we'll talk a little bit about how we came down that road and what that means. But I wanted to also first have Lori introduce herself, and Lori is the CEO of Hip Hop Public Health.
Thank you, Ambika. Good morning, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. I am honored to be the CEO and Executive Director of Hip Hop Public Health. We are a nonprofit that harnesses the power of music, culture, and science to create evidence-based resources that lift up health literacy and inspire health behavior change in young people and their families. My background is really in the sectors of public education and public health. Before joining Hip Hop Public Health about 7 years ago, with our founders, Dr. Olajide Williams and Dougie Fresh, I worked for almost 20 years with the New York City Department of Education and founded what was the Office of School Wellness Programs under the Bloomberg administration. Being part of sort of a very long organic career supporting young people, families in lifting up health, wellness, and fighting inequities. Pleasure to be here. Back to you.
Awesome, thanks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what SJN has done and a little bit about our approach. And then I'm just going to have a conversation with Lori about what it was like being interviewed for our portal. I'll show you a little bit about what it looks like as well. And then I'm hoping if any of you want to get off mic and we can talk about some of the insights, I wanted to keep this as interactive as possible. But essentially, like all of us know, and it's, this is even more pressing today, I feel, than ever before, that so much of the news cycle is both really harming to our mental health and has become very disenfranchising. As a woman of color, I've also found like the narratives around marginalized communities, around brown people, to be very, very stereotyped. And it really just kind of reinforces certain norms and doesn't really elevate anything socially. So the whole idea that solutions journalism has been in is not particularly new. I mean, they really created like a framework and a community around this, but essentially it's about reporting on responses to social problems. It's saying that communities have already created like solutions and that we need to actually elevate the solutions and talk more about those so that people can start having best practices and really start cross-pollinating across communities. It's also an accountability measure. So if one area or one community is able to do something, or a government or a local province is able to do something, they often use a solutions report in order to show another area's government what they could do. The idea is that we're based on 4 different pillars, which is the response, it's about the evidence, the insights, which we'll be talking about a lot today, and also very much so the limitations, which is like, well, if the solutions occurred, why hasn't it occurred before? Like, what are the limitations? Is it a funding limitation? Is it a local? Is it cultural? And I think that stuff is really important because it is very rigorous reporting. It's not like positive blogs or like happy news. Sometimes it's like news that actually will make people really upset that they're not getting the same services. And it's really meant to compel both government officials as well as community and civic organizations to act in a different way. So in terms of what we mean by evidence is that we're looking for the actual effectiveness of a solution. Oftentimes this does not have to be quantitative. It's not like all solutions have like RCTs and research behind them, but really like how have we seen these things work? And then also, can there actually be an insight that we can take? Not just like, it's not like a hero thing or like one person did something cool, but like, what are we actually like learning? And one thing that the New York Times quickly noted, and I think this is how SJN was basically founded and evolved to, is like a story like this about how children could calm themselves that was done in the Fixes column actually became the most email story and the most shared story on Facebook at that time, which was like 2 very big parameters. of analytics that the New York Times was measuring against. So we're really seeing both that there are a ton of solutions out there that people could write about, but that more than that, people really want to hear about these solutions. So how do we get to the Solutions Insights Lab? My background, I've done journalism. My background specifically in international diplomacy and around storytelling and around narrative chain. And one of the things I was thinking is that this approach that we have around the 4 pillars is an approach that would be really valuable for other communities that are trying to do research around these issues, whether that be a social innovation community, whether that be a community that's a community of practice around eyeglass scaling. We're currently working with the Rockefeller Foundation on a program around the Wellbeing Society. And the ideas of the future of well-being, like people are like, well, what is well-being? Are we talking about yoga? Are we talking about wellness? And we're not. We're talking about reconstructing what GDP and growth looks like, but really understanding how we could use this model to create what that narrative is and really help frame things in terms of as a research unit. So for the Solutions Insights Lab, what we did for the platform that we were supported and funded by Skoll is we actually interviewed all of the Skoll grantees and awardees. And so if you go onto our site, Joette, I can put the site's, this URL in there later in the call, but it's a pretty, if you want to look at it in your computer, it's what'sworkingsolutions.org.
You
And
can
so
put it in the chat as well.
cool. All right, I'll put it as soon as I'm off of this, or maybe
Okay.
Trish can put it in. And so essentially, we actually interviewed everybody in the portfolio that didn't already have an existing solution story. So if you already have an existing news article, we actually took this from our story tracker, which is a product that we have on SJN site. And then we actually consolidated and integrated what we were seeing with stories with the interviews that we were doing. And all the interviews were templated across our 4 pillars. And then that way, people are actually able to share and to look through this taxonomy. This is a taxonomy that we created and co-created with Skoll. A lot of it's around the pillars that the Skoll community have, but you can see that it's also about things that we're really, really interested in, which is like where the issue areas are and how the problems are actually solved. So like who's solving things around collective action? What does collective action mean? And then we have a person on our team who has a PhD, who's a sociology doctorate. And basically what that person does is do the research across the trends and the insights. So they read through all of the stories and all of the interviews, and the Skoll portfolio currently is about 300. And then they came up with these insights that they see across them. Now we're at a deeper level of these insights. So we've been seeing that, like, for example, for the public-private partnerships, we've now gotten to a level of specificity that we're not only seeing the public-private partnerships are really, really important, but specifically government investment and government interest and commitment is really important for scale. And this is something that we hear about a lot as well. So I wanted to just turn it over to Lori a little bit and to talk a little bit about the narratives and how they play a part in your storytelling and what it was like. I actually had the fortune of interviewing Lori, so I wanted to also hear what her experience was like and why she might think that this is different than the other type of media coverage or press work that you've done.
Yeah, thank you. I have to say, it felt a little bit like when we were talking, Ambika, felt like a little bit of a group therapy experience at the end of it, in a good way, in a really good way. I think, the way you asked the questions and would go sort of deeper and deeper and deeper, and not just sort of asking questions about, what do we do and what has been successful and what are you working on, but really probing into what have been the challenges. But really, tell me more about the challenges, right? And then if you were going to describe, how those challenges could impact other organizations, what are your lessons learned? And you were really, I want to say pleasantly aggressive, not aggressive in a bad, like pleasantly aggressive in terms of pushing me to think this through. And what was also great is that we didn't really have the questions beforehand. So it also felt like very spontaneous and reflective. When I ultimately went back to look at the transcript and the interview on your website, I was like, oh wow, I said a lot. Did I say all this that I want to put out there? And it was really helpful, especially, we're at a time where I think our organization is at an inflection point. We are really looking at the next level of scale. And so it was a very reflective process for me and also for our team to look at that, but then also go to the other interviews that you did with other organizations and to see like, oh, we are not alone in this challenge, or this is one of the things that we know works or we think really works, and that it has pulled out in terms of some of the major pillars that you've cut across the organization. So it was a really, I think, thoughtful experience, and I think in terms of how we tell our story, our own narrative storytelling, I think there are now things that I don't think we've highlighted enough, that looking back at our conversation to be able to say, well, this is our approach and this is why we do what we do. And we know that this is what works across all of these other, and having that qualitative data to support that as well, I think is going to be really helpful for us in terms of our, partnership developments, outreach, and our fund development outreach, which is so critical. And I think the last thing I would just say, off the top of my head, when it comes to fund development in general, there's so much emphasis on quantitative data, right? And impact and outcomes, which is so important. And having sort of an evidence-based approach of sharing insights around qualitative insights is also like, there's so much rich information there. And I think sometimes we don't think about that as part of the storytelling from a development and engagement standpoint. So like, I so appreciated your journalism and interviewing skills to like pull so much out of the conversation. And I think it was a very reflective experience, and proud to have been a part of it. So
Yeah, it was
Thank-
really, I mean, it's funny because we have a team of like 10 freelancers from around the world, as well as some of our staff members who basically do these interviews, and they're always just so awed by what the work that people have done. And I just want to go through sort of like, it's amazing because we don't ask 50 questions, we ask like 8. And I think that this is really useful for people joining today. Maybe this could help with some of their framings as well when they actually talk to people about their story or about their narrative. But essentially, we actually just people to talk about the organization's approach. I really like that word choice, organization. Like, how do you actually, like, what is your organization's approach, as opposed to like, what's your organization's mission? Oftentimes, if you ask someone what an organizational mission is, they literally repeat, especially if they're in leadership positions, what's on their website. But asking how they approach the work is often a question that people do not ask, that really makes them start to say their narrative in their own words. The other things we really like to talk about is specifically if they work with, when they work with people, if it's systems change oriented or if it's direct work, and what that actually looks like and how they talk about systems change. Systems change is a big thing in the social innovation sector, but some people do not identify as systems change, and those who do, it's really important to understand how do they actually get into that area, like what is it that they actually do as part of the systems. We talk about how people measure success, how they know things are successful. We get really interesting answers around this. I've gotten some really interesting impact anecdotes around people saying that they measure like the quantities of things, but oftentimes what they should be measuring is stories, and like how things have actually impacted people and where stories of change have occurred. I have noted that across all the interviews. And then in terms of limitations and other things, we often just say, what are some things that you tried that have not worked? And what are some lessons you've learned? Every time we ask this question, people are like, because there's just so much. And then people are like, well, where should we start? And there's so much that people have tried that haven't worked. So we often reframe it like, what's a lesson you've learned that would be important for somebody else trying to do what you're trying to do? And then they usually can really narrow it down, which is exactly what I was asking here, like something that you tried that you would impart to say something else. And Lori's answer was just so interesting. She was basically saying, I would say there was something that we did that we thought didn't work, but actually was working. And we just didn't do enough research to roll it out. And I think that that's, an elephant in the room as well, where a lot of times like we're doing stuff and it is working and we don't even know it's working. And so we haven't, it's really hard to also build in evidence and research and in all of the initiatives the social change people do. We generally always ask about the challenges. And every time we ask about challenges, we basically say outside of funding, because funding is a challenge for everybody, everywhere, and everything in the space. And so we specifically asked, like, what else have your challenges? And this goes back to what I was saying before, like, what does it mean to be a systems change orchestrator? How do people see and how do people identify themselves in the space? And then what do they need from other actors if they are identifying a systems change? Of course, we ask, sorry, go ahead, Lori.
No, I was going to say, after you finish scrolling through this, I wonder if you could also show the PDF that has the insights highlighted.
yeah,
I
sure.
also found that was, and I don't want to get into your flow, but since we're having a conversation here, like I thought that was very helpful for me, especially, but also reading through, there's such rich interviews across all of these organizations, but then to see the call outs was super helpful for me as well.
Oh yeah, I can totally share that. I'm so glad that you noted that. And it's funny, we always end every interview with saying like, is there something I should have asked you? And pretty much everybody has something else that they need to add that hasn't been like asked. And so what Lori's specifically referring to is that when you're on the site and and actually go to the downloadable PDF interview, we actually highlight things that I think are like, I would say either insights or sound bites, depending on if you're how you're coming into the position. So I love this one. When we combine things through music, it could soften the message. It makes it more approachable. And when you connect it to a cultural form like hip hop, it becomes sticky. So things like that are just really, really great things to just like remember what you're saying. Because I mean, the interviews, they're actually only about 45 minutes, but once we transcribe them, they're about 8 pages long. And so yeah, so it's really nice to kind of see them in this context and things. I would love to open it up to people and see what people are interested in. I actually wanted to spend some time and ask folks about some of the insights and what they thought, and maybe spend some time talking about them and if they experience it. But I mean, I know we're a small group, so I would love to hear like I'd love people to introduce themselves or talk a little bit about we can keep going down the narrative road, or we can talk a little bit more about the insights road. I don't know if the people on the call right now are like comms folks and like storytellers and would like to talk about the solutions journalism approach, or if they're more innovation and entrepreneurs, and we can talk more about the insights. But it would be great to hear from folks what they're interested in talking about. And just, I know I've made this, I know I've said this, and I'm going to probably keep saying this, but this is not a work of journalism. Nothing that we're doing here in the Solutions Insights Lab is a work of journalism. We do not like publish the stories. We don't like it. We don't consider this like reporting that we're doing. We're doing these interviews using this approach, and we come up with this database with the insights, but it is absolutely not a work of journalism at all. And we do not classify it as such. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear as well. But if anybody wants to come off mute and talk a little bit about their role in their organization, either as a social entrepreneur or as a comms person, we can get into some depth in this conversation in this latter half of this call today.
I had a question.
Please.
From a comms perspective. My name is Wando. I am based out of Lagos, Nigeria. My question really is about the stories we're telling. We wanted, to shift the narrative, and somebody said complete the narrative. So the social innovators want the dominant culture to hear their story, not really, they don't want to speak to themselves. How do you avert that? Because we end up only in platforms that are within ourselves, and I'm not against that, but then we can't find them. They're not profiled or amplified because we're within philanthropy and those kind of mediums, because you can't get to, and you spend so much effort and finances trying to get to a bigger platform. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing. I mentioned this very briefly, but I think it's worth mentioning further now. So hopefully I can do this in a very fluid way. But essentially, when you're on this database, there's two types of stories that we have. We have the interviews that we did, as well as all of the stories that we have found about this group of people, these 300 grantees and awardees throughout the internet. So that's very close to almost exactly the same things that we found in terms of the interviews. And if you even look at Lori's, one of the first things that comes up when we look at Lori's is her story. So this is a story that she's done that's actually covered by NBC, which maybe I can have her speak a little bit about. But this is actually stuff that we have integrated. And these are not just like press stories. We're not interested in press stories. If there's press stories, there would have been like 1,500 press stories. I mean, Lori's had her organization written about like many, many more times than just one. The reason we chose this particular story is because we have a vetting committee that actually looks through all the pillars and makes sure that it ticks all the boxes. And they're not, most things do not go through that committee. It takes a really long time to actually make a solutions journalism story in terms of like all the 4 pillars. And this one did. And so that's where actually that it's come from. So if you actually go to the story tracker, which is this product that we've had since 2017 that now has more than 16,000 stories, these are all the stories that we have either sourced or people have submitted to us that classify within the 4 pillars of solutions journalism. And so when we actually started working with Skoll on this project, or I should say when we started working on this project that was supported by Skoll, we looked for all of these stories across these grantees and awardees and came up with a list of all the stories. And then we figured out through our vetting system which one of those stories were solution stories. So that's quite a lot of stories, like 170 stories written in mainstream press around this stuff is not shabby. But maybe Lori, you can speak a little bit more about the NBC story and about how you get your press coverage as well.
Of course, it wouldn't be a Zoom meeting if I wasn't on mute when I started talking. It's so interesting. I mean, we are a relatively small size nonprofit, and we always say we like to punch above our weight class. And so while there are folks that we are working with to help, elevate our work and sort of have media connections and placements, some of these stories are organic. People hear about us from speaking at conferences or seeing an article that was written and following up and things like that. But I'm just looking back at this particular story was kind of interesting. This one we had been working with a couple of folks to have direct media sort of placements and outreach with our founders, Dougie Fresh and Dr. Williams, and kind of trying to have this sort of, I don't know, narrative storytelling around like Dougie and the doc, like this very interesting approach to how this unlikely pair came together to look at health behavior change. But also last year was the start of the 50th anniversary of hip hop.
Oh,
And
yes,
so
right.
there was a really unique sort of pitch there where there were lots of stories, celebrating the birth of the genre, but then how we were connected to the birth of the genre from a social justice impact perspective. Like from our perspective, hip hop wasn't and isn't just an incredible musical genre that was created by teenagers, like when the Bronx was burning in New York City, but it was really, I think one of the original manifestations of talking about what we now talk about as the social determinants of health. It was what people were seeing in where they live and work and play and pray, and the fact that it was teenagers that came together with artists. So there was a unique sort of niche last year to really connect to that hip hop 50 story. But I would also say that also was I don't know, sometimes like a negative thing for us, because sometimes people would just see our name. And I kind of also referenced this in our conversation in the interview, Ambika, like because we are hip hop public health, some people just stop when they hear the words hip hop. Like, what is that? They just dismiss it, thinking we're just some sort of entertainment or so, like, what is this? Or they're not hip hop adjacent, so just let it go. And not realizing, we're not necessarily a hip hop organization. We're a public health education organization that connects through music to develop culturally relevant and engaging resources. So I would say, going back to what Wando was saying at the beginning, like for me, having this interview, while Ambika, you're saying this isn't like a journalism piece. For me, this is a great development piece, right? Having this out there where when I'm meeting a prospective funder or prospective partner, to be able to link to this conversation, which says so much, I think, about like the ethos and the pathos about who we are, very different from like a two-pager, right? But it says all the things, like you pulled out all the things that I would want to have in that two-pager. But to have that in this like storytelling way is a very, I think, approachable way of sharing more about who we are. And I think we as an organization want to use this not just as a learning experience, but a way of how we can use it to engage with other folks to tell about our story as well.
Yeah, I think that I think that that's definitely true. The other thing that we've seen, and this is sort of just like in terms of like us, how we've been tracking impact, is that we've seen that it does obviously help people like reflect a lot. A lot of times people, it's exactly what Lori said, like people respond to us and they're like, wow, we never really thought about all that in that depth. I feel like it's a fairly in-depth interview. I feel like a lot of times when people talk in interview these days, they're like, so what are you working on? And how is that going? And how did that go? And how is this? But this is a much more reflective process because we're trying to really connect the dots in terms of the narrative. So I do think that there is enhanced funding interest in terms of the narrative for sure. And people have been using that, and we've been seeing people say that. So yeah, I feel like we're trying to start creating communities of practice. It's so interesting, Wando, that you were saying about how like you feel like the space is just talking to itself, because I think that I've seen two exactly opposite reasons for what we're doing, which is one, there is no space where people are talking. And like, so that people want to use the Insights Lab and our research narratives to help create a space. And then I think that the other reason is that there is, a space created, but people aren't actually sharing within that space. Like people identify, everyone at school identifies as a social entrepreneur, social innovator, but like there's very little insight sharing. So I feel like a lot of what we're doing here is helping with that. And I think that it's interesting because in some ways, and this goes back to exactly what Lori was saying, yes, when you want to reach out to people and to get more mainstream coverage on your story, it's really, really helpful to be part of a community of practice. But it's also sometimes you need to distinguish yourself from that community of practice and everything, rather than just being seen as like a social innovator. You want to be seen for exactly what you're doing, which is like you're using music for health, or, exactly what your approach is. So I think it's oftentimes both. I will say, and this is a discussion I've been having more and more because I have a lot of political views on like what's happening in the state of the world today, and in terms of like the election series. There's I think about 40 countries in the world up for elections this year. But social innovation and social entrepreneurship is really filling a gap that government and public services haven't had. And oftentimes when we come in and we start doing that work, while it is really innovative, there is a lot of that is public service work. And so I think that there's also that tension that we have to be really clear about. Lori, I don't know if you, yeah, I'm like, okay, I'm seeing your smile. So it definitely resonates with what you're saying.
Yeah. And also, what Nwando's saying about, people talking with one another, like we are newer, we joined, we began to be supported by the Skull Foundation about almost almost 4 years ago now. And so we're relatively newer in this network. And for us, there are so many of these gatherings that were never really on our radar before. So it's very interesting. But I hear what she's saying about, like, there's sort of a what's the word, like an ecosystem of the different talks, and folks are featured here and there. I would say, like, from a different perspective, it just made me think about something I haven't thought about for a long time. When I worked at the New York City Department of Education, and like working, overseeing health and wellness and physical education, you know, I would say that the media community wasn't always looking to see what we were doing well. It was always like trying to catch you doing something wrong. And I was, very new in this role. It was 2003, and I was literally an office of one, working with 1,700 schools and 3,000 to 4,000 health and phys ed teachers, and an initiative that was trying to resurrect, quality health and physical education across the largest school system in the country. At any rate, we were implementing some really exciting initiatives. But whenever I was interviewed by an ed reporter, like an education reporter, there was always like a very specific edge. And it was like whatever their focus was, what they liked, what they didn't like, you're the cupcake police, you're this, you're taking this out of schools, or you're adding this, whatever it was. If like 80% of what I said in the interview got out there, and I'm talking like major mainstream newspaper, right, or a media outlet, respected media outlet, not, let's say, like something that was more editorial, if 80% got out there, like in the way that I wanted it, it was great. And oftentimes then the headline would be completely like awful, right? That being said, the thing that I just thought about was, one time I ended up getting interviewed by a sports reporter, because, like, I guess that's whoever they had. It wasn't like a typical ed reporter. And the interview was like incredible. It was exactly everything that we discussed, and it was lifted up. So, like, without agenda, without focus, where it was like trying, not happy about this, the administration. So sort of like being able to be in other circles, like when I'm thinking about the communications focus, like, a lot of times we're presenting at education conferences, at health conferences, but being able to have these conversations in other venues that were not necessarily in the room, I think is really, really valuable. And from the comms perspective of being able to have that story told from, like, even as you're talking about the work that you're doing with the Rockefeller Foundation about well-being, like, this is, you're talking about economic forums. You're not necessarily talking about in like your typical health and wellness forum. So I think being able to cross-pollinate in that way, more intentionally, not just because it just so happened that this is the reporter that was sent, and they're like, oh, I have to do this story. I really like sports, but I'll do this phys ed story. I think could be really valuable for sure.
That's really, really interesting. And that's, I don't know, I'm not that surprised that the sports person was, because everything to them is fresh. So it feels fresh. They don't come in with the thing, or like they're not trying to shape it to be a certain thing. So I could totally see that happening. How about the rest of you? Are the rest of you comms folks or social entrepreneurs? Or I'd love to hear, Nwando and I know each other, so I'd love to hear from people I don't know as well. We can't have 20 shy people on a call. So there's got to be some people here who are not shy.
Maybe I can go. My name is Nourelon Chad. I'm the System Change and Learning Lead in Triple Line. A lot of my work is around measuring system change and learning about what works in terms of system change. So you asked, what are we interested in? I would be quite interested to hear a bit more about your approach, but also some of the insights on system change that are coming out from this exercise.
Yeah, sure. So I'll go through the insights very as an overview, and then I'll talk a little bit about one of the main things that happened as soon as we did these insights is that people were like, and how? And so the first 100 got us to these insights, And then the second 100 got us to the how. We're actually trying to publish the how. So that's why the hows are not yet on the site. We're actually trying to publish it either in like a journal or, you know, co-partner with someone. This goes back to like trying to get into a larger audience. But some of these will obviously not surprise you about networks expediting the pace and scale of change. So really the insights that we're trying to find here are not making a successful social innovation organization, but specifically scaling social innovation. So they're all around like, how can you actually scale? So networks expediting the pace and scale of change. I think that this has been the big movement of the last like 10 to 15 years, which is like all network shifts and network shifting. Public-private partnerships. This is what I was saying earlier in the call. One thing that we have found, it's not this, that it's public-private partnerships, but that the government absolutely has to play a key role. Like they have to either be contributing financially, be invested, be doing things. Otherwise, it's really, really, really hard to scale. I previously worked at Reach Digital Health, which used to be PrayCal.org, which was school awardee last year. And I know we have a very, very tight, or we had a very tight, they still have a tight relationship with the South African Department of Health. And that's really, really important to making sure that maternal health platforms scale. Systems change is more likely to occur with access to unrestricted funding. I feel like the philanthropy space, this is kind of like what we've been beating on the head for a while. And we saw this through all of our interviews, which is like not that it's funding for any project, but that it's actually unrestricted funding, because so much of systems change happens in the interconnectedness, like in the, you know, in that muscle, rather than it being about something specific. Solutions developed on the ground are more likely to reach to achieve broad reach. This is also something that I think is even more recent that we've been hearing. So this one about sustainable solutions being co-designed with communities and encouraging agency and decision-making power. One thing that we realized was that it's not just like that they're involved, but they actually have to be part of the designing process. It's not like they have, like we do a focus group with them, or like they're sort of peripherally, like, you know, given their input, but actually the solution was co-created or co-designed by them. So it's one step further than I think what we've been hearing in the past. This is something I think that there's a lot happening around, which is that systems change is really, really slow. And I think it's really, really hard to focus on scale when you're doing systems change. There's a lot of like separate parts that are going together. It's really hard to be committed and stick with that focusability. I often find that, you know, systems change is sort of like the outcome. It's like the end of like all the work that we're doing. But like on a day basis, we have like funding reports, we have like meetings that we go to, you know, and it's like, it's really hard. I think about it like in terms of even raising kids, you know, like I got to get my kids on a school bus. I got to make sure that I sign their forms. I got to make sure all of this stuff, but I'm also raising human beings. And I think that like that long-term approach requires an intense amount of focus. And I think this is honestly where the field is like really trying to figure out how we're going to do that. Solutions spread faster with available and accessible data and tools. It's really good to know. Especially with open access stuff. For some systems change work, it's important to shift societal narratives. We've seen that happen. I think what's really interesting here is that so much of systems change work is culturally specific. So then how do you shape narratives if it's culturally specific work? It's like, how are you going to shape a narrative like across like the US, Lori, like with communities that are really different from each other, or across regional communities that don't have that? And one thing that we've seen, and I don't know if this resonates with you, but basically what we've heard is that there's an overarching theory of change or overarching strategy, and then a localization and a cultural approach to that. So there's like, it's like, there has to be an umbrella container. There has to be. Otherwise, you're not really scaling. And then everything is really specific to the community or region. Is that, would you say that resonates?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we have two validated frameworks that our founder has created over the years. One is called a multi-sensory, multi-level health education model, and then a child-mediated health communication framework. And so when we create our resources or programs or interventions through those frameworks, we then have the opportunity for localization and for the adoption and adaption of those resources. Sometimes we were part of that adaption. So for example, during the height of the COVID pandemic, we created many resources around COVID vaccine literacy. But then, for example, we did one that was more nationwide across the US, but then we had worked in Baltimore specifically to quote unquote, as the teens called it, Baltimoreize the videos and have the backgrounds that looked like
Totally.
in Baltimore. So the theory of like the evidence behind the messaging and the approach was not any different, right? But what young people wanted to see in the background of the animation of these music videos was they wanted to see the Freddie Gray mural. They wanted to see local HBCUs. They wanted to see the Baltimore waterfront. They wanted to see a certain park. They wanted to see that it
Yeah, that makes
made
sense.
it felt and looked like their community. But you know what? Not every like organization is open to adoption and adaption. Sometimes it's like, oh, this is what it is. And I think that's been really important, like for us to be open to that and to understand that, you know, to really have cultural tailoring, to really have things that are culturally relevant, there has to be that opportunity to make it, you know, speak to communities and have the voice of those folks in the target audience or the target population that you're trying to reach as part of the process. It'll just make it even deeper. I mean, one other example, like more globally, you know, one of the programs that first started our work is a hip hop stroke program that Dr. Olajide Williams, our founder, created. And then there was a team in the Czech Republic that came to his offices at Columbia and studied with them and has now adopted that, working with artists that are, you know, culturally relevant in the Czech Republic to implement this hip hop stroke awareness and prevention program. And they're kind of taking it and running with it. But it makes sense because, you know, hip hop that is more relevant in New York may not be, you know, culturally relevant in the Czech Republic.
Yeah, I mean, I find that, you know, we've all agreed that cultural relevance and localization is key. Like we can't do anything without it. I just was really interested when we started reading through the interviews and the insights about like, well, then how do you keep any consistency? And so I think what you're saying about those two models of like the overarching thing, it's so important to make sure everybody is still kind of going towards that light, you know?
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole point. Like when you have an evidence-based model, right? How do you maintain the fidelity of that and also allow for the cultural adaptation? Of course, like you would then want to see like what does it look like from an implementation, dissemination to implementation approach, right? How is that uptake and what has changed? But I think that's something that in order to have like deeper implementation and scale, I think there has to be that flexibility for adaptation as well. And I think one of the things that we hope to do at some point is to create, to kind of take what we've done and create more of a web-based opportunity for other researchers or other artists or other educators to be able to work through our model